Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming. My name is Alika Burma, and I'm acting director of Torch. Torch stands for, it's an acronym for the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities, and at Torch we promote, encourage and support interdisciplinary research and wider engagement within, across and beyond the humanities. Tonight is a very exciting opening event in Torch's Book at Lunchtime series, even though it's evening. A fortnightly series of bite-sized book discussions exploring new books, new publications in the humanities. We have some really fantastic books lined up this term and are thrilled to be opening the series with Jonathan's exciting and wonderful new biography of Ted Hughes, which we're here on this panel to celebrate and discuss. So how things are going to unfold is I'm going to briefly introduce the four panelists. Then Seamus Perry is going to say a few words about the book, followed by Oliver Taplin, and then Jonathan Bate and Farrar Donovan are going to engage in discussion about the book in the light of those introductions and more. So Jonathan Bate is a celebrated biographer, critic, broadcaster, scholar, and provost of Worcester College here in Oxford, and also, of course, the biographer of this biography of the poet Ted Hughes. This biography lauded, although in interestingly qualified terms also by a critic in The Guardian just this past weekend, as a scrupulous and lucid exploration of some of Ted Hughes's demons. Seamus Perry is the head of the English faculty and has written extensively on Hughes. Oliver Taplin is a classicist deeply committed to the theatrical life of ancient drama, and he's worked on productions with the National Theatre and the Royal Shakespeare Company, including on Hughes's Oresteia. And Farrar Donovan will be further introduced by Jonathan in their discussion, but suffice for me to say now she is a cousin of Ted Hughes. So it gives me great pleasure now to hand over to Seamus Perry to introduce the biography Ted Hughes to us. Thanks so much.
Right. Am I audible? Yes, okay, lovely. Well, I'm extremely pleased and indeed honoured to be here to celebrate the appearance of this remarkable book. It's going to be a sizable part of the Ted Hughes scholarly literature for as long as there's a Ted Hughes scholarly literature, I think. It's going to be to Hughes scholarship what Ellman's great biography is to Joyce scholarship, and I can't pitch praise much higher than that. I think it's a great achievement. One of the things that struck me about it particularly was the relationship between Jonathan and his subject, and the aspect of Hughes that seemed most compelling and pertinent to think about in that context was the fact that Hughes is obviously a very seductive person. There's a great anecdote. The book is full of terrifically good and well-chosen anecdotes, but there's a great anecdote of Hughes and his companion, Assia, in this case, entering a party, and someone saying, as it were, spontaneously, unable to say anything else, "Who are those gorgeous people?" And there's absolutely no doubt that Hughes was gorgeous in some fundamental way. I don't just mean in the obvious way, the way that his brother Gerald says rather beautifully in his wonderful memoir, Ted and I, which is a fantastic book to read if you haven't read it. Gerald says that Ted was very popular with the ladies, which is one of the things I'm going to include in the Oxford Book of Understatement, which is currently being prepared for press. It's not just the seductive personality of the man, but that gets transferred, or at least there's something analogous to it, in the poetic voice. And I've always been very struck by the way that Hughes's poetry has a kind of power, an ability momentarily to disable or to paralyze more normal sorts of judgments that, for example, Hardy's poetry or Larkin's poetry does not have. I mean, they're doing different sorts of things. And what I always remember is teaching Ted Hughes to a group of absolutely impeccable and clean-cut American undergraduates. And to give them a break from my voice, I played a tape of Hughes reading a poem from Crow called Apple Tragedy, which is one of his many sort of bleak, cartoonish rewritings of Genesis. And I can't do a Ted Hughes impersonation, but it ends, the reading, very, very powerful reading. I didn't give them a text, they just listened to the voice. And it ends with Hughes saying something like, the voice is something like, and Adam smashes a chair on its head, and God says, I am well pleased, and everything goes to hell. And there was about 3 seconds of absolute silence, and then the room erupted in this extraordinary feral kind of cacophony of whoops and like baboon-like cries as these young pillars of the American Baptist and Catholic and Jewish establishment sort of discovered some mad primeval sort of joy, and absolutely extraordinary teaching experience. And then, of course, I reasserted Eurozenic Oxford rationalist control and got them back again. So there's astonishingly sort of powerful and charismatic, obviously, about Hughes, and I think that must have been a particular challenge to a biographer. Every biographical subject, I guess, must be someone who the biographer in some senses loves. You can't spend all that time with someone for whom you feel nothing, and sometimes, of course, the love can go bad. And there are a great example in the Romantic period, in which Jonathan and I both work, is Norman Fruman's biography of Coleridge, which is really the record of a love affair that has gone sour. And Fruman, can't forgive Coleridge for letting him down. And the book is like a character assassination, really. And Roger Lewis's recent book about Anthony Burgess is the same. Love is there, but love has sort of gone wrong. Well, I think that Jonathan's book is a masterpiece in a way because he obviously does love Ted Hughes, and certainly loves Ted Hughes' poetry in some way, but he hasn't been seduced by Hughes. And I think it's partly because Jonathan's mind isn't very much like Ted Hughes' mind. And I think that's what makes the as it were, the tension of the book, the traction of the book so good. Jonathan writes very, very well about Shakespeare. Ted Hughes writes dreadfully about Shakespeare, or at least he writes very, very well about something that he calls Shakespeare. It's not Shakespeare. And I think it's that kind of dissonance in a way between the way that Jonathan's mind gets to work on things and the way that Hughes's mind gets to work on things that makes the power of the book. So there are three. I'll be very brief now. There are three ways, particularly it seems to me that resisting Hughes, as it were, makes this book very, very powerful. One is that Hughes had an absolute genius, and it's a genius that he shared in ways that were both constructive and destructive with Sylvia Plath, but an absolute genius for mythologization, which includes self-mythologization. And Jonathan absolutely understands that and gets that and gives wonderful examples of it. But also, without being in any way merely corrosive and skeptical and debunking, he also, as it were, corrects the mythology. So you, as it were, you get the raw materials from which the mythology is constructed, but then you also get, as it were, a wonderful evocation of the mythology. The way that Plath and Hughes mythologized themselves almost from the very beginning in terms of Heathcliff and Cathy, for example, is extraordinary and strange. And of course, in some ways, they were a bit like them, and in other ways, they were nothing like them at all. The other person who Plath, I was fascinated to learn, likes to invoke when she's talking about Ted, is Mellors from Lady Chatterley's Lover. And you think, well, if you had to choose Heathcliff or Mellors, I mean, neither of these are terribly rosy sort of analogies, as it were, are they? So it's a romantic life, and it's interesting, and I think telling that Jonathan began life and remains, of course, a romanticist, because it's a life of the sort of dimensions of a Byron or a Shelley, and has the same kind of challenge for the biographer, which is to humanize it. It's not, as it were, to sensationalize it. All the sensationalism is there. It's about trying to bring it back within a more sort of humanly dimensioned kind of portrait, and I think it does that brilliantly. The second thing I think that resisting Hughes does so powerfully in this book is resisting Hughes's notions of determinism. Hughes was a fantastic fatalist and believed in astrology and all sorts of other kind of mad, kind of alchemical determinisms. The judgment of Bate that will go down in history for characterizing all this is the page on which he says that Hughes often said things that were bonkers. I can imagine undergraduates using bonkers for years to come. But what emerges from this book, and I suppose it's true of any human life, but it seems particularly true of Hughes's life in an odd sort of way, is that it's full of, as Jonathan says, Frostian roads that weren't taken, things that might have happened but then didn't happen. And I think that's something that we're not, particularly used to associating with Hughes, but it did remind me of a terrifically good passage in Gortete, which is one of the many poems in Hughes's oeuvre that Jonathan draws our attention to. And I think this is terrific. Listen to this. As each person carries the whole world like a halo, albeit a dim and mostly provisional world, but with a brightly focused centre under the sun, considering their millions, all mutually exclusive, all conjunct and coextensive, he sees in among all the tiny millions of worlds of this world, millions of yet other alternative worlds, uninhabited, unnoticed, still empty, each open at every point to every other and yet distinct, each waiting for him to escape into it, to explore it and possess it, each with a bed at the centre, a name, a pair of shoes, and a door. It's a remarkable passage, and I think that Jonathan's biography sort of captures that brilliantly well. And the last thing, I'm finishing now, the last thing, and it's one of those roads not taken that the book evokes so beautifully in a kind of Hardy-esque sort of spirit. The road not taken was the alternative career that Hughes imagined retrospectively for himself towards the end of his life, which was the career he would have taken had he written and published about Plath earlier. And that would have been a more fruitful career, Hughes came to think. And Jonathan evokes his sense of that alternative life beautifully, I mean, with great poignance and human tact and rightness. But at the same time, there's an alternative story here, which I would want to just end on, which is the Plath poetry, of course, that comes at the end of his life is remarkable and becomes a publishing sensation and all those other things. But in a way, the literary judgment that I was most struck by in this book was an emphasis upon those really great poetic sequences of the 1970s, the farm poems that are collected in Moortown, Season Songs, which is a beautiful collection of natural lyrics, and especially Elmet. The book is terrifically good about Hughes's writings, Remains of Elmet, which then gets revised as Elmet, which are his sort of autobiographical poems about growing up and his family. And they do establish Hughes as a great poet in, as Jonathan says, a Hardy-ish tradition, not a tradition of myth and Jungian archetypes, but a much more kind of humanly scaled poet. So I thought a good way of ending would be a very brief poem from Remains of Elmet, a poem that shows absolutely the vindication of a biographical method, because it's a beautiful poem in its own terms, as I hope you would all agree. But at the same time, once you've read this book and you pick up on what the references are, it becomes an even more beautiful poem. So, as it were, knowing the biography enhances your pleasure in more than merely a kind of contextualizing or scholarly way. It's called Heptonstall Cemetery. It's where the Hughes family is buried, including Sylvia Plath. Wind slams across the tops, the spray cuts upward. You claw your way over a giant beating wing, and Thomas and Walter and Edith are living feathers. Esther and Sylvia, living feathers, where all the horizons lift wings, a family of dark swans, and go beating low through storm silver toward the Atlantic.
I'll go next. I'm ancient enough to have had conversations with W.H. Auden and Robert Graves, but I regret that I never had the chance to talk to Ted Hughes properly, although I did once exchange a manly handshake with him. I'd keenly appreciated his poetry since I was 19. I arrived here in Oxford in 1962, so my first Hilary term was that sustained snow-clad freeze which lasted all the way without going above zero from January to March 1963, which was such a bitter time in the story of Sylvia Plath and consequently of her husband. Robert Graves was at that time giving his enthralling, almost messianic lectures as Professor of Poetry, and the most celebrated modern poet of the day was indisputably Philip Larkin. But for myself, Larkin never really appealed to me. I turned much more to this volume, and when I mean to this volume, I mean to this very copy of this volume, the New Poetry, edited by Al Alvarez, and especially to two poets who I first found in there, Tom Gunn and Ted Hughes. Now, since then, I'm happy to say quite a few younger poets have come along who have spoken to me far more than Larkin ever did, and even some women poets. There's not one single woman poet in the whole of this anthology. Some of them, have to be honest, meant even more to me than Ted Hughes, and I'm thinking especially of Seamus Heaney and Tony Harrison. But as I read Jonathan's gripping biography, it struck me that those two, Heaney and Harrison, both have some relevant preoccupations in common with Ted Hughes, which were not important, were even positively alien to Larkin and the New Movement. And I mean a fertile and unapologetic engagement with the literature of ancient Greece and Rome, and a direct and fruitful engagement with the theatre. And it's this combination, poetry, classics and theatre, that is my ticket today. Now, I don't think I've got time to talk about Ted Hughes' interaction with Peter Brook for Seneca's Oedipus in 1967 to 1968, but it was the most extraordinary and fortunate confluence, in fact, only brought about because Laurence Olivier fell ill. The most extraordinary confluence of two of the great creative synergies of our time. I heard Peter Brook give the most amazing extemporary 3-minute talk last year, without a word in place, beautifully elegant and full of pith. Nor really can I talk about his Ted Hughes' interaction with Tim Supple, who I think is possibly the nearest we now have to a successor to Peter Brook. But it seems clear that the harsh and ritualistic language that Hughes developed for the characters in Seneca, characters which he likened to a spider people scuttling among hot stones, that was a hot stepping stone on the way not only to August, the great expedition that he and Brook had to what was then Persia, but also to Crow. Now, in the 20 or more years after Oedipus, there were various classical resonances in Hughes' work, especially with Prometheus and his vulture, and to the orgiastic elements in Euripides' Bacchae. But I'm going to fast forward to the three major engagements in Hughes' last 6 years or so. First, there was, in a sense, another lucky break after Ovid, the anthology of new translations of Ovid's Metamorphoses that was brought together by Michael Hoffman and James Lasdon. At the same time as scholars were rediscovering Ovid as a ludic, postmodern poet, that was not at all what appealed to Hughes. He goes characteristically for what he sees as a primeval underlying essence in the Ovid, and that essence is passion. Passion, I quote here, passion where it combusts or levitates or mutates into an experience of the supernatural. The result came then developed into the 24 episodes of Tales from Ovid, and that was a highly unpredictable confluence again of two very different poetic streams. And what about the Greek plays towards the end of his life? Hughes seems to have embarked on Alcestis in 1993, but have put it on one side before it was finished to take up for the Oresteia. And I suspect that the primary impulse behind choosing the Oresteia was the Aeschylean obsession with the family curse. And I think if you go through Hughes' works, you will find the motif of the curse. And the exploration that Aeschylus gave him the opportunity for, to explore that through visceral language, and I mean visceral both figuratively and literally, as he likes the colour of innards. There were many cuts and expansions, but this is actually, this Oresteia is the closest of his classical versions. Its language is for Hughes relatively straightforward, and interestingly, he doesn't subvert the conciliatory ending of the trilogy, which is a major crux of modern scholarship. Is it a real reconciliation and housing of the dark powers, or is it in fact opened up for future wounds? Now, so far as I know, he had no direct involvement in what became the eventual first production a year after his death. It was put on in the Littleton space, now the Dorfman, at the National Theatre, and directed by Katie Mitchell. And I went through the text with Katie for many hours, and I went to many rehearsals. And I thought it was a powerful and innovative production, and so, by the way, did Seamus Heaney. But I have to say it was far more Mitchell than Hughes. She positively bristled against some things in the text, particularly its masculinity. And actually, she and I did quietly make some changes. I remember, for example, in the prologue of the third play, Apollo is referred to in a 3-word sentence as Son of God, God with a capital G. And as we crossed that out, Katie said, I'm sure Ted wouldn't mind. But whether he would mind or not, we missed, obviously, his presence was missed. And I think there could be another production of that text with more poetry in it, and perhaps less naturalism than the Katie Mitchell production, fine though it was. So I wonder very much how Blanche McIntyre will treat it in a production that opens in Manchester next week on the 23rd of October. But I know she's reduced it to one play, so it won't give the Hughes poetry its full breathing space. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to be able to get to that, but in September 2000, I did get to Dean Clough Mill in Halifax to see the first performance of Hughes' Alcestis, done by Northern Broadsides, a company you may well have come across. Now, I think, to be honest, that the director, Barry Rutter, was a bit out of his depth. He certainly could have done with Ted Hughes helping him in the interpretation of the play, but it was still well worth seeing. What I remember best, though, from this production is not actually the Euripides Alcestis, but the semi-burlesque reenactment of the Labours of Heracles by the drunken Heracles, which is a huge interlude in the middle of the play. Because the first 2/3 of Euripides' play is a tragedy of the death of Alcestis, wife of Admetus. Then the last third is kind of fundamentally anti-tragic in that it involves a resurrection in which Heracles brings his friend's wife back from the dead. And between these two parts, Hughes added this substantial, strangely grotesque interlude. Now, it seems there's evidence, I think you mentioned this, Jonathan, or I forget whether I got it from somewhere else, that this whole episode, the Heracles, the labours of drunken Heracles' labours, was added when Hughes turned back to Alcestis in 1996. But why, without any commission, had he embarked on this particular play in the first place? This has to be because it is about the wife who dies instead of her husband, who dies in order to let her husband live. And as Jonathan has acutely spotted, the most, and this I think is an interesting phenomenon, the most piercing line in the whole play has only been the most piercing line in the whole play since 2010, when the poem Last Letter was first published. Let me put you in the picture. Alcestis dies on stage, as she does in Euripides. Her penultimate words in the Hughes are, "Death wants only one of us." 5 lines later, when she has just died, the chorus leader in the Euripides says, I quote, "She is gone. The wife of Admetus is no longer alive." In Hughes, the chorus leader says, Alcestis is dead, your wife is dead. And as revealed in last letter, those were the very words with which the doctor on the telephone informed Ted Hughes of the death of Sylvia in February 1963. Later on the same page, Admetus says, and this is not in Euripides, this is Ted Hughes, now I have to act like a man in control and manage the funeral, exactly as he did indeed do in February 1963. In the play, though, the wife is restored to life in a happy ending in the play. Hughes closes his version with a pretty close translation of the final words of the chorus in Euripides, and then he's added a single line, 5 monosyllables. And I would very much like to know, and I hope perhaps Jonathan can tell us or find out, whether these 5 words added after the end of the Euripides play were there before the revision or whether he added them in 1996. Those 5 words are, let this give man hope. Thank you.
They were indeed added in the 1996 manuscript revision. The extraordinary thing about the line, your wife is dead, it was put in the manuscript very, very late, and you can tell that because the manuscript is in one kind of ink and your wife is dead is in another. And I think the point about the idea that one or other of them must die, one of the documents that I discovered was the diary of a rather fine poet called Susan Alliston, whom Ted was with on the night of Sylvia's death. And her diary records, and this is the first time it's been made known, the last phone call between Sylvia and Ted. And after Ted put the phone down, he put his head in his hands and sat on the bed beside Susan, and he said, but if I go back, I die. It's her or me. Such was the agony of this relationship that had collapsed as Sylvia's manic depression got worse in her final months. It's a huge pleasure to have with us tonight Anne Farrar Donovan. Farrar is a very important name for the Hugheses because Ted's mother was called Edith Farrar, and she came from a family who all lived in this village of Mytholmroyd, where Ted was brought up. Several of the Farrar brothers went off to the First World War. There was Tom, there was Walt, and Edith was the sister. There was also another sister, Hilda, who was a very important figure in the story. There was another brother too called Albert, who had a very sad life and ended up taking his own life. But Ted Hughes' childhood in Mytholmroyd was dominated by the Farrars. Edith married William Hughes, an itinerant carpenter, but it was the Farrar family who really dominated his childhood. And indeed, the first poem that he read on the radio was a poem called The Martyrdom of Bishop Farrar, about a distant Farrar ancestor. He was fascinated by the Farrars. Nicholas Farrar was the name of another famous Farrar who founded the community, the religious community just up the road from Oxford here at Great Tew. And of course, Ted named his son Nicholas after Nicholas Farrar. So it's a huge privilege to have a Farrar in the audience. Anne is Uncle Tom's granddaughter, but has vivid memories of the Farrar family, of Ted coming back to Mytholmroyd, of Aunt Hilda, and indeed of Uncle Walt, who's such a crucial such a crucial figure in the story. It was actually Anne and her aunt who discovered Uncle Walt dead on the floor. So for you, Anne, a rather different experience reading my book than for Seamus and Oliver, who were reading it as scholars and people knowing Ted's poetry. But could I begin by asking you, what did it feel like to read a book where some of the characters, many of the characters, are people that you knew?
I think it was quite it's been quite an emotional few weeks since I first read the book. And I think this is because in so many instances these people were very prominent in my past, and in most cases in a very happy way. But Ted, from a very early age, was someone who was part of my life, but interrupted this fairly calm life in this Yorkshire valley, because often when he came home, it was to put into place parts of times of chaos in his life. So there were some very happy times, but there were also some very sad times.
Yeah. One of the crucial times in his life where he did spend time there was when in the late 1960s he bought this house called Bank. And if any of you have been to Heptonstall, Seamus read so beautifully, one of my absolute favourite poems, the Heptonstall Cemetery poem, the house that his parents had moved to by this time was up on the hill on this road that leads up towards Heptonstall Cemetery, a house called the Beacon with a fantastic view. But from the Beacon you look down into a dip to some woods, and there was this other house down there, Bank, which Ted considered buying in 1963 at the time of Sylvia's death, but actually ended up buying in 1969. He eventually gave it over to the Avon Foundation for writing courses, and that's an interesting part of the story. But you saw a bit of Ted and indeed the children in that Bank period.
By the time Ted bought Bank, his parents' house was literally... Bank sat in a wooded valley. It was a mill owner's house. It had the mill, the chimney, and the long house. And Ted's parents had lived in the house at the top of the lane, and we lived 2 minutes away from them in another house at a place called Heptonstall Slack. So by the time Ted came back to Yorkshire, Assia had died, things were difficult. He had these 2 small children, and he came home because he needed the family to sort of breathe some order into all of this. You know, he was in a relationship by then with Brenda Hedden, and Brenda came with him, and Brenda had 2 children of her own. And for a time, I think it looked like it might work. You know, he got back into some sort of flow. The children went to school. They were sad little things. Certainly in those early days after Assia Wevell's death, I think she had tried her very best to be some sort of mother to them. And of course, in the meantime, she'd had a child of her own. So not only did Frida and Nicholas live this family unit life with Assia Wevell, but they also had by then a sibling. And when Assia died, the sibling, obviously, his life came to an end as well. So it was locked into this thing of wanting to be in this home in Yorkshire and somehow get some order into what was really chaos, I suppose. Yeah.
I found Brenda Hedden a very impressive, very strong woman. I think in a way she was pretty well the only woman who ever actually dumped Ted. But I think there was great strength in that bond. And I remember you mentioned to me recently that many years later you saw Ted down in Exeter and she was on the platform. What?
No, Ted spoke to me later and he said something. He said, I had a really strange experience. He said, I got off a train. I arrived back in Exeter on the train, and by then he'd be in his 50s. He'd have been in his mid-50s by then. And he said, I got out of the carriage, and I was walking down the platform, and in the distance, he said, I saw the back of this person, and he said it was Brenda. And he said it brought back all these memories of... she was really quite... she had a very magnetic personality. She was bohemian, she was beautiful, she was lively and everything that... she was just a lovely person. But, she had a very nice... She had a husband, she'd left, she had 2 children who, again, complicated the situation. And, I think that was... She left Ted. She went to be the housekeeper for a guy called David Garnock. He was Lord Garnock. And but that was literally a few hundred yards from the house in which we lived. And while she was still there, Ted married Carol. He brought Carol to Yorkshire. Carol at that time was 21 years old. And when I think about having a 21-year-old daughter now, and I think about projecting her into a position where she was with a man who was considerably older and looking after 2 children who were probably traumatised. It was an unusual situation to observe.
It certainly was.
Yeah.
Family was obviously very much a sort of grounding for Ted, as you said. Seamus and I share this huge admiration for the first book of poems where he really talked about his childhood and the village and the moors, his home, the Calder Valley, Remains of Elmet. And I think I'm right in saying Melvyn Bragg made a South Bank show about that. And I believe that sort of Ted came home to watch it. Can you tell us about that?
I suppose it was he thought that this was where it should be. He should experience what it was going to be like to watch this with his family. In the end, he didn't watch it. But he arrived the day before with this big copper pan. And I can remember my mother looking at this pan and thinking, oh dear, what am I going to do with this? And he placed it on the Arga, and it filled the whole of the Arga top. And inside it was venison, and he was very proud. It had taken him days to, he'd hung the venison, and it had all been matured and everything else. And then he brought the cases of red wine, and he wanted it to be he wanted it to have a sort of celebration. He wanted it to be a celebration of this. So we all sat down, we ate the food, and we all sat down to watch the South Bank show, and Ted disappeared. And he walked the paths of his childhood while this was going on. He obviously didn't want to be part of this bit. It was too, but happy memories.
Yeah, and he sometimes brought friends, other writers, back home, didn't he? Seamus kindly said my book has many good anecdotes, and I could have had far more. And I think an anecdote I particularly now regret leaving out is a number of people who met Ted in various times, usually when he went to poetry festivals. Ted would arrive in his car, his battered old car, he was a terrible driver, and then he'd open the boot, and it would be full of corduroy trousers, and he'd offer his host a sort of bargain on some corduroy trousers. And this is, there's a theme in the book. He's always got these money-making schemes, but I wish I'd done a little bit more on corduroy trousers, and I think you had a corduroy trouser story.
He was just passionate about corduroy trousers. My grandfather and Uncle Walt had started this business, or Uncle Walt had started this business, and over the years it had developed into making clothes for hunting, shooting and fishing. So of course this was Ted's passion, but also his passion was dressing his friends. So they would arrive in Hebden Bridge or in Mythenroyd, and they would be preceded by a very good lunch, usually where they probably consumed a lot more than was healthy for them. And then they would come to be measured. And so Seamus Heaney would arrive, or Melvyn Bragg would arrive, and they would climb to the top of the stairs and be duly measured for these trousers. And then, of course, the stairs are quite steep, and they would have to somehow navigate the steps back to Ted's Morris Traveller, and with a stack of trousers he was taking for his... Yeah.
It's extraordinary that was the Morris Traveller that Sylvia had driven around the lanes of Devon in, and I was... one of the lovely things in writing a book is doing the picture research, and I found a fabulous old picture that was taken by a woman called Frances McCulloch, who was Ted's editor at Harper & Row in New York. It's been a great pleasure for me that my book is published globally by HarperCollins, and Harper in New York was Ted and Sylvia's publisher. And it's a photo that shows the famous elm trees at Court Green that Sylvia wrote her great poem, The Moon and the Elm Trees, about. But in the picture, you can just see the Morris Traveller. And after Sylvia's death, Ted couldn't bear to get rid of it. He carried on driving it, and then eventually it just stayed in the driveway of Court Green. It was one of those old sort of half-timbered cars, and it just sort of rotted away, but he couldn't bear to let it go.
There were actually two of them.
There were two Morris Travellers.
There was a green Morris Traveller, and there was a maroon Morris Traveller.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is a tragic story, and in a way, among the most tragic elements of it is that Ted and Sylvia's son, Nicholas, took his own life 6 years ago now. Olwyn, Ted's sister, who was a wonderful, wonderful help to me. Sadly, she's not well now, but from 2010 to 2012, when I was doing the research, she was a fount of information. And two things I remember in particular about Olwen in relation to tragedy. One was I went to see her very shortly after the news of Nick's suicide, and she and Frida had to fly all the way to Alaska to bring his body home. But what was interesting after that is she began to speak about Sylvia in a different way. Previously, she'd always talked about Sylvia as this difficult woman. But after Nick's death, she talked about Sylvia's illness. It was as if, for a long time, she'd had a very kind of Yorkshire pull-your-socks-up attitude. Depression isn't real. You should just get on with it. But when Nick took his own life, it was as if Olwen finally realised depression is real, depression kills. And from that point on, she seemed to speak much more sympathetically about Sylvia. The other memorable thing she said about that was, we were just talking about all the tragedies that Ted had endured, and she said, I'm so glad he died before Nick took his life, because that was the one thing he could not have endured. And yet Frida survives. Anne and I were both down this week at an opening of Frida's new collection of paintings and poems. And Frida has now read, I think, about half the book, and I think, like you, found it difficult. Obviously, she said she'd never read a biography of her mother or her father before. But she's a rather extraordinary survivor, isn't she?
She is. From fairly timid, not timid, she was always a child who stood back and observed. When they were very small, Nicholas was the one who wanted human contact, and Frida was the one who stood back and watched. And my memories of them were with these big eyes, and Nicholas's needs were one, Frida's needs were another. And she was the one who had the more difficult time, because Frida was the one who, when in her new book of poems, she's the one who writes that she, in the women that Ted brought into their lives, she looked for the mother in them. They looked for her mother in her. And I think that the problem was that the women in Ted's life looked at Nick, and he reminded them of the man that they loved, and they looked at Frida, and they saw the woman that haunted them, that was present in their lives every day. So Frida sort of pulled back from the life, Ted's life with these women. They weren't going to be substitutes. They weren't going to work as substitutes for a mother. So for many years, she lived a very different life. She married when she was 19. She didn't have very much money. She worked in the tax office in Exeter, and in that sense, it was quite. So it was only really by the time she was in her 30s, and she went to Australia and had this different life in Australia and things, that she really began to be independent and grow as a person in her own right. She didn't read their work, so she didn't have that conflict of people saying you write like your parents and things. She really has survived magnificently out of what has been a very, very difficult life for her. You know, I mean, to lose your mother to suicide, to lose your brother to suicide, to know that your father is seen as this devil figure in a way throughout the years that you grow up. I think she bore a lot, but she has risen through this magnificently.
Thank you. I'll just end with one more anecdote. There was a point that one night, a rainy night, Ted knocked on Frida's door, not having seen her for quite a long time. He just came and sat himself down and said, "Ask me anything." And of course, she wasn't prepared for that and just couldn't think what to ask. But then she did ask the obvious question. She said, "What was my mother like?" Because, of course, she was only 3 at the time of Sylvia's death. And Ted thought long and hard, and then he said, "Her hands were exactly like yours." And there's actually a rather beautiful poem in Birthday Letters where he plays on the sense of Sylvia's hands living on in Frida's. I wrote at the very end of my book that Ted Hughes loved Sylvia Plath until the day he died. And when Frida read that, she said, "Yes, that's what he told me every time that he telephoned me." And thank you so much.
So Jonathan's happy to take some questions from the audience.
I will refer you to my interview on the Today programme this morning, now available online. In the course of researching the book, my admiration for the Elaine Feinstein biography grew, actually. We need to remember it was published in 2001, very shortly after Ted's death. At that point, only a few of his manuscripts in Emory University in Atlanta had been catalogued and made available to researchers. And nobody knew the extent of his correspondence, which only really became clear when a selection of his letters was published 6 years after that. And certainly nobody knew that there was a huge second archive, which only became available to the public in 2010 in the British Library. And that included tens of thousands of words of journal entries. And Alwyn, Ted's sister, who was so close to him all his life, his gatekeeper, his agent, didn't even know that Ted kept a journal. So the resources available to me were far, far vaster than those available to Elaine Feinstein, which is probably why my book's about 3 times as long as hers. But where her book is very valuable is she was at Cambridge around the same time as Ted and Sylvia, and she captures very good interviews with some of their contemporaries. And then she, as a writer, a poet and translator herself, was involved with a number of his projects, the Arvon Foundation she taught for. She was also involved with the magazine Modern Poetry and Translation, one of his great projects to bring Eastern European poetry into English. So there was very, very useful interview-type material there. She also got interviews with some of the people connected with Assia Wevel, who are now deceased. It does seem to me it's a very important aspect of biography that although one works, a scholarly biography should work above all with documents, and I've spent 5 years in those archives working on the documents. But the gathering of testimony while it's still available is, I think, a very important part of the work of memory and memorialization that biography does. I was fortunate enough to get very good interviews from Seamus Heaney, from a very good friend of Ted's, fine writer called Ben Sonnenberg, from Danny Weisbord, who collaborated with him on Modern Poetry and Translation. They are all now dead. There's a sense that the body of people who have important stories to tell is rapidly diminishing. So I think it's often the case that a first biography, an early stab at a biography of a writer or artist or famous person who's just died, whilst it will not be able to take the measured overview, and probably a lot of documents won't yet have been available, but it can sort of capture some of those fresh memories, and I think Feinstein did that. I think the main thing that has changed is my extraordinary admiration for him as a prose writer. I began with a lot of reservations about that sort of big, mad Shakespeare book. But actually reading his critical prose, many of his unpublished prose essays, his work on Coleridge, and above all the journals and letters, and often letters and journal entries are themselves kind of masterpieces of writing and of critical analysis. There are also wonderful prose character sketches. I begin to think that although he only ever wrote short stories, not novels, his gift for characterization meant he would have been a very fine novelist. So huge increase in admiration for the prose work. In terms of the poetry, as Seamus has suggested, my admiration for that, the Elmet project, as I call it, because it exists in 3 different incarnations, has risen hugely. I suppose I slightly hoped that my skepticism about some of the work in the 1970s, collections such as Cave Birds and Prometheus on His Crag, I hoped that skepticism might have been overcome, but actually I ended up thinking even less well of him in sort of high mythic mode. I think the work in the theatre, I was very lucky that the Peter Brook archive was made available to the public very shortly before I finished, and I was able to get fantastic primary materials about this extraordinary August project. In terms of my feelings about him as a man, I've said on a number of occasions, because inevitably the sort of press around the book is sort of concentrated on the more scandalous aspects of his private life. And I've said on a number of occasions, I don't think it's my view as a literary biographer to pass moral judgments on the man. But I have sort of ended the journey feeling extraordinary admiration for the fortitude with which he endured so many terrible things, some of which, of course, he brought upon himself, but that he survived without becoming an alcoholic, without becoming deeply depressed. He did occasionally get prescribed antidepressants, but he pushed through, which I think showed extraordinary fortitude. And I do think, and this would be the last part of the answer, that working closely with Olwyn for a period did really open my eyes. I remember one of my last meetings with her before she fell ill. I said, what's the most important thing that I should say about your brother? And she said, you should say that he was a kind man, and that Ted's problem with women was that he didn't want to hurt anybody, as a result of which he ended up hurting everybody. It's a very good question. You know, there should be a symposium on exactly this subject, because the view that I took was that the job of the biographer is to find out as much of the truth as possible and to state it in a balanced and reasonable way. But it's also the case that where you are working with the living, privacy has to be respected. So my conversations, for example, with Brenda Hedden did involve a considerable to and fro process of us agreeing that certain things would not be spoken of. And I think ethically that's an obligation. Brenda Hedden was actually angry with the Elaine Feinstein biography because she felt stitched up. She wasn't shown the final version, and she felt that Elaine represented her as a rather sort of evil, mad seductress. But there's an odd thing about privacy, though, because as is well known, Carol Hughes, Ted's widow, withdrew cooperation from the project at an early stage. I was very scrupulous to safeguard her privacy by trying as far as possible only to mention facts about her and her marriage and her life with Ted that were already in the public domain, for instance, through the selected letters of Ted Hughes. But the result of that is that Carol Hughes is a rather shadowy figure in the book. In protecting her privacy at some level, I've written her out of the story. And that I think is a kind of no-win aspect of biography when people are still alive. But of course the difficulty is if you wait for people to be dead, you are not going to be able to record their stories for posterity. It's certainly been a tightrope walk. I am now off duty as far as Ted Hughes is concerned, and I am never again going to write a biography of a writer who died anything less than 150 years ago. So Seamus will be pleased to hear I'm going back to the Romantics.
That's probably an excellent note on which to end. Just before we acknowledge this extraordinary panel, I'd like to point to the fact that there's wine served to the side on your left, and also there are books on sale, and Jonathan will be happy to sign them. So it remains for me on our joint behalf to thank the panel. Thanks so much.